Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this webinar. Thank you for attending the third session of this workshop on enhancing responsible business in Southeast Asia. This webinar series is jointly organized by the ISEAS-Yusof Institute and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. First, before we begin, please allow me to share some housekeeping issues. The Chatham House rule applies to this webinar. To pose questions, please use the Q&A function. Do identify yourself. Please share your name and institutional affiliation. To raise any technical problems, please use the chat function. Thank you for your cooperation. We will now begin the webinar on migration and reinforcement of social protection. This webinar will be moderated by Dr. Akihiro Ueda. Dr. Akihiro Ueda, please.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me well? Thank you for joining us. I'm Akihiro Ueda, moderating today's webinar. On behalf of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and ISEAS-Yusof Institute, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar. The topic that we will be discussing today is on migration and reinforcement of social protection. We will explore the experiences and challenges of migrant workers in countries of origin and destination, and how businesses can contribute in promoting responsible migration and decent work. The speakers have been requested to identify concrete responsible business practices for addressing inequalities and labor issues. In addition to non-discrimination as understood by human rights, these practices can also include practices that are designed to address societal and governmental deficit. So we have with us a panel of very well qualified speakers to address these issues. Our first speaker is Dr. Darian McBain, who is a Global Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Thai Union. She is responsible for implementing change that will drive sustainability through the entire global seafood industry. She will speak on human trafficking in the Thailand seafood industries. We have also Dr. Wako Asato, Associate Professor of the Graduate School of Letters, Kyoto University, Japan. He's a sociologist focusing particularly on social welfare, migration in East and Southeast Asia. He will touch upon the theme of migration policy reform and its implementation in Japan. Next, we have Dr. Reiko Ogawa, professor at the Graduate School of Social Sciences, Chiba University, Japan. Her research interest is on migration, gender, civil society, and globalization of care work. Dr. Ogawa will examine Southeast Asian migrant workers in Japanese long-term care. The fourth speaker is Dr. Hwok, Senior Fellow and Co-Coordinator of the Malaysia Studies Program at ISEAS-Yusof Institute. He has researched and published work on inequality, social protection, labor, and education, with a focus mainly on Malaysia. Dr. Lee will talk about migrant labor and social protection in Malaysia. Our speakers will have 15 minutes each to make their presentations, and there will be a session of questions and answers after that. I shall now hand over the time to our first speaker, Dr. Darian McBain. Dr. McBain, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the honor of being able to speak here today. Hello, everyone. And I would like to speak to you about Thailand and what's recently happened. Allow me to share my screen. Can I ask, can everybody see my presentation? Hopefully I get some nods. Excellent. All right, so today I'd like to speak to you about Thailand and what's happened in recent years, and particularly from a migration and social protection perspective. And so Briefly, I work for Thai Union. Now, Thai Union is one of the largest seafood processors in the world, behind two of the large Japanese seafood processors. And we are headquartered in Thailand and listed on the stock exchange in Thailand, but we really operate globally. So the tuna that we source comes from all over the world. Shrimp, sardine, mackerel, they could come from many different oceans, as well as we source aquaculture species. Our largest market is the United States. Second largest market is Europe. We have branded business as well as private label business. And really, I'm telling you this to give you a perspective that it is a very global company, although our name Thai Union implies that we only operate in Thailand. But what it also means is that when issues affect a country, so Thailand, it directly impacts us as a company, Thai Union. So in 2015, this really came to light. And I'll go talk you through a few different aspects of this. So the first was the EU-IUU yellow card. So the European Union said basically to the Royal Thai government that it didn't trust its regulations of the fishery sector. And so it issued it a yellow card, to use a soccer term, to say that if you don't improve your performance, then you will be stopped from sending exports to the European Union. So that really required the Royal Thai government to bring in about major changes to how the fishery sector was managed. What it also did was highlight that the Royal Thai government needed to do work, particularly on human trafficking. And the human trafficking into the seafood sector had been highlighted by the media. So the international media, in 2014, The Guardian, UK newspaper, or now a global newspaper, had issued an article which was talking about what they referred to as ghost ships. So ships that stayed in the Gulf of Thailand primarily, and workers were trafficked onto those vessels. They remained there, usually in debt bondage and forced labor, where they were processing fish that was caught and then sent back to land to be turned into shrimp feed and fed to the shrimp, which is then processed and sent around the world. Now, following that article, there have been many different stories really across all of Thailand looking at both human rights, human trafficking in particular between Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and as well as the environmental issues regarding the regulation of the fishery sector. Now, you also had US lawsuits being issued on forced labor. So there are various pieces of legislation in the United States that prevent forced labor, also trafficking, victims of trafficking. And these were being brought against major US companies, so retailers as well as brands, with the implications of what was happening in Thailand around human trafficking and forced labor. There was a global Greenpeace campaign against Thai Union specifically, rather than the country, and that was drawing attention again to human trafficking and forced labor issues, as well as the environmental issues in the global seafood industry. So we had angry customers. So for us as Thai Union, as I said, one of the largest seafood processors, we had customers in the European Union, the US, Japan, Australia, who were very concerned about these reports that were being received. And so this, I want to really say that the issue of human trafficking was not just an NGO issue, it wasn't just a media issue, it very much became a business issue as well. And so then we also had a government and transition. And so the Royal Thai government, there had been a coup in 2014, and the US and the European Union had to suspend diplomatic relations. And so trade was one of the only ways that they were able to engage with the Royal Thai government. The US Trafficking in Persons report, very important around the world to look at which countries are doing well and which perhaps are not, had ranked Thailand as a tier 3. So that's the lowest tier, which implies that in the seafood sector, but also in other sectors, there were some serious issues that needed to be addressed. There were also a lot of active NGOs, large-scale NGOs like Greenpeace and local NGOs who were advocating for change. Now, specifically on migration, a lot of these challenges, particularly into the factories that were processing seafood, but also into the vessels that were catching fish, you had migration, particularly from Myanmar, but also from other neighboring countries such as Laos and Cambodia. One of the main reasons for this is that Thailand has a basic minimum wage, which is well above any other country in the region. And so if a worker wanted to migrate for economic reasons, it made sense that they would come to Thailand, and the Thailand economy was booming. And in addition, Thailand had a very low rate of unemployment. So there were generally jobs there. But what we found was that workers were getting into debt bondage through that migration process. Added to all of this, there was the Rohingya Crisis of 2015. Now, I'm not sure how many of you remember this, but what was happening, people were fleeing from Myanmar, and they were really on their way to Malaysia, another majority country for Muslims to move to, and they were being taken by boat. In the middle of that year, around March of that year, they estimate that 50,000 people were taken by boat from Myanmar out by people smugglers. So this was human trafficking on a large scale. The boats couldn't dock anywhere. No country was letting them in. They were at sea. The people were in distress. They were being trafficked into other areas, whether it was seafood or other land-based activities. But it was certainly a major crisis for the region to do with trafficking. So another challenge then resulting from all of that was the media. And so the media started looking at slavery and trafficking in the Thai fishing industry. The world's eyes for certainly 2015 and 16 were focused on what was happening in Thailand, and in particular, human trafficking, which was a major issue. So for Thai Union as a company, we responded by creating Sea Change. So Sea Change is our sustainability strategy. It has three overarching objectives: that the seas are sustainable now for future generations. So that's an environmental criteria. That our workers are safe, legally employed, and empowered. So that is very much around human rights and the treatment of workers. And then that the vessels that we buy from are legal and operating responsibly. And I should say Thai Union doesn't own any vessels. We are a seafood processor, so we own factories. The vessels are all in our supply chains. And as you can see, there are multiple aspects of this program. So a very big focus on what we call safe and legal labor, looking at how workers are working, how they're treated, how they are recruited, and really their satisfaction while they were in their jobs. Also having responsible operations, so making sure we had traceability in place, making sure that our factories had good health and safety practices, responsible sourcing, which is about the environmental performance of the fisheries and aquaculture we're sourcing from, and then working with our communities. And I won't go into too many details, but this helped us develop a really strong human rights due diligence framework, which has these fundamental parts. So a basic statement on policy and human rights, assessing the risks. So for example, the risk of trafficking and the risk of resulting debt bondage, prevention. So how do we make sure people don't get trafficked or into debt bondage? Detection, remedy, so taking action when you find something, and then continuous monitoring and disclosure. Now, at about that time, there was a very vocal NGO, non-government organization working in Thailand called the Migrant Workers' Rights Network. And so in 2015, we invited them to come into our factories and said, have a look around, talk to all of our workers. You can look at any of our employment records and tell us what are the key issues that we need to be dealing with to ensure that workers do have a safe and legal place to work. Now, they told us two things. One was to develop essentially worker voice mechanisms, so how workers can speak to management and have their work better dealt with. But the other key point was ethical recruitment. So they emphasized to us that workers were coming to Thailand, mainly from Myanmar, and that they were paying many recruiters and facilitators along the way. And so once they got to Thailand, they had these huge debts, and it sometimes took them, you know, a year, 2 years to pay off those debts. Thai Union wasn't charging those debts, and yet they still found themselves indebted. And so we set up a policy with MWRN in 2016 to make sure that hiring and recruitment was managed consistently, professionally, fairly, and transparently. And so it was really trying to get to ensure that we didn't have labor exploitation, and particularly that child labor and human trafficking were not part of our supply chains and part of our own operations. And so this policy, you can have a look at it. It's available freely on our website. And what you can see here is part of our recruitment process. So what we did, and I can talk you through it, is we cut out working with recruitment agents in Thailand. We started working directly with a recruiter in Myanmar who was trained on our code of conduct and our ethical recruitment policy, and set up this quite significant process that you see here, working with the agent in Myanmar, our own human resources team, and the Migrant Workers' Rights Network, so the NGO. So it goes through this process, as you can see, that we have our demand for our factories. So we have 5 major sites in Thailand that we advertise, the pre-interview, a health check, passport processing, that's very important to make sure that people are of age and they can legally work. Pre-departure training is another very important step so that our workers understood where they were coming to, that they understood they were going to a fish processing facility, that they could think about what it would be like to move countries. Because as you know, Thailand and Myanmar do not share a common language. Generally, it's a huge language barrier. And so they have to understand how they can do their banking, for example, how they can access healthcare, if they have children, where their children can go to school. Then we go through the process point to get a worker's permit, signing it off, transported across the border into Thailand, the visa, and going to the factory. Now, when we started, I think we thought this would be a relatively easy process. It's still evolving, you know, almost 5 years later. There are always ways that we can improve. And because you're working with the governments, some things you can't speed up. And the entire process takes around 60 to 90 days. So it's quite a slow process, but at least you know that the workers are there legally. We had an independent evaluation of that policy done in 2018, which found that in general, there's a large reduction in the recruitment-related costs by the workers, that the workers are feeling safer coming to Thailand because there's less likelihood of trafficking being involved. We've had an increase in job applicants, and the agents have become much more professional and are being recognized for their recruitment credentials. We've also done work with our supply chains to help them improve practices. So you can see here a lady who's holding up a safety working kit. It's got all sorts of medical equipment that is now taken onto vessels. So we did training with the vessels to help them ensure that the workers on the vessels are treated safely and legally and also have access to medical care. The other picture is that we've done ethical recruitment training for recruiters in Myanmar. And this is a photo of one of those examples. So if you aren't training the recruiters to recruit ethically, then there will continue to be incidences of human trafficking. And so that is a really quick walkthrough of why human trafficking was such an issue in Thailand and one of the solutions that we were able to bring about. So I'll stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McBain, for your presentation with concrete cases. I understand that seafood industry is one of the most vulnerable in terms of protection of migrant workers. And efforts made by Thai Union appears very informative, not just for Thailand, but also for seafood industries in other countries. Now, our next speaker is Professor Asato, who will be speaking on migration policy reform and its implementation in Japan. Professor Asato, floor is yours.
Okay, let me start the presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank organizers for this opportunity. Even though this was supposed to happen in March in Singapore, now I am able to share my research result with you. My topic is about Japan as a destination country in the new era, and I'm going to compare between new and old pathways of migration. Well, the purpose of this presentation is to give brief description on new migration scheme called the Specified Skilled Worker Program, started recently to accept 340,000 in 5 years on top of the de facto unskilled worker scheme called Technical Intern Trainee Program, or TITP. This new program is to actually differentiate from the old TITP, which is very notorious scheme, pointed out by the United States as the hotbed of human trafficking, by providing a new freedom in the Specified Skilled Worker Program. One is direct hiring. This is to free workers from brokers or agencies. And second is to introduce computer-based language tests to let the applicant free from school fee. And third is to provide equal work and equal pay principle to protect migrant worker from cheap labor. And also the SSW allows migrant workers to change employers to provide more freedom of movement. However, even with this new reform, due to lack of interministerial coordination and lack of price control in the sending side and other reasons, this specified skilled worker program will be malfunction in the future. So meaning to say the TITP and SSW become similar pathways in the future. At this moment as well. So this presentation is based on interviews to multi-stakeholders, including migration industries, including sending organization, agencies, and government organizations in both in Japan and sending countries, particularly in Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia, and so on. So this is a sketch of the Japanese state of residence or visa scheme. Well, Japan has been accepting students or TITP as a non-professional level or unskilled worker. And in the upper part, the professional categories were put. However, in this new specified skilled worker scheme, it is set in the position in between professionals and unskilled. So it was the Japanese status of residence was originally divided into separate professional and unskilled. Now, because of the new scheme, the semi-skill level is started. This is called Specified Skilled Worker Program. Because of the declining fertility ratio and because of the decreasing number of labor force, and also declining unemployment ratio up to 2019, government was started to introduce the series of new schemes from 2008. In 2008, Economic Partnership Agreement started with some Asian countries that allows to accept some care workers to Japan. In 2017, the TITP law was revised and proper new scheme was enforced. In 2017, new status of residence care was started in 2017, and in 2018, there was a new proposal on specific skilled worker program. In 2019, specified skilled worker program started, targeting 340,000 people in 5 years by 2024. So this series of reform of migration, this was supposed to fill the gap between the labor demand and supply, but the problem was the migration channel become very, very complicated. Take the example of elderly care, for example. Now, currently available, there are 4 available migrant pathways under Economic Partnership Agreement. student status of residence of Kaigo, or a TITP, and the newly started the specified skilled worker program. So this complicated system made a new problem of a providing not transparent system, and also not perfect information for the workers to make a rational choice, which is the best way to go to Japan. For example, the EPA provides heavy supports migrant workers scheme for the skills enhancement, while TITP, specified skills visa, is the on the burden of financial burden on the worker side. Okay, so let me just compare between TITP and new schemes called specified skilled worker program, so that the these two old and new channel become similar, even though government intention was different originally. First, let me talk about the existing TITP. This TITP has been cited by the United States State Department for human trafficking, but to this day, it is an important migration pathway that supplies unskilled workers to Japan. The original, the intention, objective of this TITP is actually international cooperation to transfer skills, technologies, or knowledge accumulated in Japan to developing countries and other regions to promote international cooperation. But it's very interesting, even though in the name of international cooperation, this is paid by migrant side for the international cooperation. This is a very sharp contrast between the ODA, official development assistance of the Japanese government, which provide huge amount of money to the developing countries, while this TITP is all paid by migrants themselves. This program is becoming very popular and main channel of migration in Japan to fill this gap of the unskilled workers. At this moment, 3,688,000 TITP workers recruited to Japan, headed by Vietnamese at 189,000, Chinese 81,000, Filipinos 33,000, and so on. It's rapidly increasing. But the one of the issue is the frequent violation under TITP, and the as this shows, the 80% of the TITP employing enterprises violate labor laws, meaning to say this indicates that the companies that employ them are concentrated in small and medium enterprises that are less productive and less internationally competitive. And main violations are workplace safety and health violations, wage violations, and working hour violations. This TITP is also known for producing a lot of runaways, what is called runaways. And the number is rapidly increasing, particularly in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Myanmar from Mekong region. So because of the high recruitment costs, as I will show you later, and also the low wage. And interestingly, this TITP has a different placement control in the country of origin. For example, China, Cambodia impose no caps on the legal placement fee, while Philippines does not allow any placement fee, according to the Memorandum of Circular. So let me just explain the general condition of TITP, what is called runaways. This is shown in 10,000 yen or 1,000,000 yen level. And one of the very interesting point is the Vietnamese runaways. Those who runaways paid around, on average, 1 million yen or 1 million yen, or about 10,000 US dollars for as a recruitment cost, while Filipinos on average pay only 20 or 222,000 yen. So there's a big difference between Vietnamese and Filipinos, which creates the difference, as I mentioned. The Vietnamese rapid increasing of the runaways, while Filipinos, it's not in the list because the number is very small. 5 minutes, okay. And let me show the other. This is the distribution of recruitment fee under TITP between Vietnamese and Filipinos. You see, this is the average of those of runaways, what is called runaways. 1 million is average for Vietnamese, while only 200,000 yen is the average for Filipinos. So there is very different. I mean, one of the conclusions that I would like to mention is that there is no price control mechanism under TITP, even though there is a memorandum of understanding between Japan and the country of origin. And there is another peak around the 1.6 million yen, or the 16,000 US dollars. There's another peak. So Vietnamese shoulder very high placement fee in the country of origin. And there's a big gap between the expected wage, I mean, the wage that is explained by the recruiter, and actual wage, which really discourage the computation of migrants when they are working in Japan. Let me just talk about the new scheme. As I mentioned, this scheme was to differentiate the existing TITP, but it becomes similar. As I mentioned, even though specified skilled worker program allows direct hiring to minimize the brokerage fee, and also introduce a computer-based test to free the school fee, and equal work, equal pay principle is imposed, not to make the worker cheap labor, and also changing employers were allowed to provide more freedom of movement, unlike TITP. However, during the negotiation between Japan and the sending countries of origin, there was a strong opposition from sending organizations, government, and also for the protection of migrant workers. Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines, and other countries decided to not allow direct hiring, but to go through agencies to protect migrant workers, which really the same of the agencies under TITP program. So meaning to say that channel pathways of migrants between TITP and SSW are quite similar. The language requirement is also actually, information is enclosed by language schools, and the general applicants have difficulty in getting information except registering the existing language school. Therefore, the huge amount of pay is incurred, as in TITP. Even though there is MOC, Memorandum of Cooperation, between Japan and countries of origin, there is no fundamental price control over placement fee. So it means that the market mechanism cannot be modified the same in TITP. So let me just conclude. Even with a series of reforms of migration channel, it just complicated the migrant pathways to Japan, particularly taking the care sector as an example. There are 4 pathways to come over to Japan, which really provides the imperfect information for the migrant workers to make a rational choice. Usually, different migration channel result in different outcome, but in this TITP and SSW, those become very similar due to institutional path dependency. And even though the SSW was established from the perspective of a human rights approach, it doesn't guarantee in practice because of the absence of price control of the placement fee, and also the absence of a multilaterality between countries of origin and destination. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Asato, for providing an overview of both technical intern trainee program and new specified skilled worker program. And it's kind of unfortunate to learn that even this new rights-based framework doesn't work. Migrant worker policy is one of the most pressing issues in Japan, And I suppose that there are many Japanese business people listening to this webinar interested in this issue. Perhaps Professor Asato can make some concrete recommendations later at the Q&A session. Next speaker is Professor Reiko Ogawa, speaking on Southeast Asian migrant workers in Japanese long-term care. Professor Ogawa, please take the floor.
Thank you very much for having me today. I really appreciate this effort together with Singapore ISEAS and SPF. I want to follow up with what Professor Asato had mentioned about the Southeast Asian migrant care workers in Japanese long-term care. Oops. Okay, so first about the background. I will describe about the background very briefly, and then the migrants in the long-term care sector. And finally, I would explain a bit about the responsible business practices in long-term care. Although the history that the migrants entered the long-term care sector has been very recent, so I do not have that much to contribute. But since it's a growing sector, it's going to have a huge impact. So first of all, about the background of Japan's multiple crises, we do know that we have a major demographic crisis. That's the low fertility rate and aging population that accelerates the labor shortage because the productive age population is decreasing. And that puts a major pressure on the sustainability of the social security. So today we see that women, elderly, and migrants are all sought to mitigate the labor shortages. So this is the population projection for the next decades to come. Japan's population has already peaked and it's declining now. And in 2020, we see here that it's very obvious that the productive age population is shrinking and the aging population is increasing. So here, the aging ratio, Japan is in the forefront of the aging society, and currently the aging population for those above 65 years old is like close to 30%. So that's in 1 in 3. And in the next decades to come, it's going to reach 40%. So what the policy response to this demographic crisis was twofold. In the late 80s, a national certificate of certified care worker was established. So this sets like a kind of a standard for the migrants to enter into the labor market, as I will explain later. And then in 2000, there was an establishment of long-term care insurance, which was based on the realization that long-term care can no longer be handled by the families alone. So the socialization of care took place, and socialization of care means that both finance and workforce will be regulated under this long-term care insurance. The LTCI has been funded by both insurance premiums, that's 50%, and taxpayers' money. So it's a public social insurance. And the result is that, of course, expansion of the care market and increase in social expenditure. So this is the number of the care workforce that you can see in the blue line. So since its inception in 2000, the number of the care workers increased by threefolds, and so as the number of old age persons who need care by threefolds, and so as the expenditure. And the government estimates that by 2020, there's a need for 2.3 million care workers. So we have a huge deficit in the care workforce. 2025 is a year that the post-war baby boomer generation will enter the age of 75 years old, the likely age to become frail. So in the past years, the labor shortage has been felt by care facilities more and more. So the latest figure shows that more than 50% of the care facilities, the residential care facilities, are experiencing either short or very short in terms of care workforce. So responding to this huge demographic and social change, the number of migrants has grown in the past years. And as Professor Asato has explained, largely they come from this TITP scheme. So if we look at where the migrants are in the labor market, this 1.6 million actually consists like 2.4% of the total workforce in Japan. They are largely into fields like manufacturing, wholesale and retail, hotels and restaurants. So the source of labor, the migrant labor basically comes from the TITP program as well as the students. And as you can see, the health and social welfare sector shares only 3%. And this is because the deregulation of the policy only took place in the past couple of years. So, but I think this is going to grow in the future. So as already been explained, currently we have like 4 different channels for the migrants to enter into the Japanese care labor market. And it's very, very complicated. It basically started with this economic partnership agreement from 2008, where Japan had a free trade agreement with Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam to promote free trade, but then also to accept migrant nurses and care workers. The condition was that they have to pass the national national exam for care worker to become a certified care worker, and that if they can pass, they are allowed to stay and continue to work. So, and then for those EPA care workers, they were trained for 1 year in Japanese language. But after that, there was a deregulation took place under the Abe administration since 2017. So the long-term care visa was enacted in 2017. So this is granting visa status for the students who graduated from the technical caregiving schools. This is for 2 years. So normally the students will come and study Japanese for at least half a year, and then they enter the caregiving school. And then we already know about this TITP, which is very problematic. And then the SSW just started. So for the EPA migrant care workers, a number of research has been conducted. And since this was the first time that Japan accepted migrants in the reproductive field, people in the beginning was very anxious about how the migrants would be able to adjust and perform in the care facility. But if you look at this research, which is conducted in Tokyo, 3 care facilities in Tokyo that employs migrant care workers, and a questionnaire was distributed to the Japanese staff, 102 of them. But as you can see, the response is very, very positive. And for the EPA care workers, I won't say that they don't have any problem. Actually, they do have a lot of problems, including labor issues, but still the scheme allowed them to settle and upward mobility and ensure the citizenship. So for those very few people who passed the national exam, they've already brought their families. So currently close to 500 spouses and children of the EPA care workers who are certified are now settled. And after 10 years of the implementation, many are promoted to become leaders and managers, and some have already obtained the permanent residency and have gone up to the higher position. So as we already know, for these 4 programs, 4 channels for migration, the requirements differ from one another. So different eligibility, different levels of language. But the main thing that we have to know is that aside from EPA, the rest of the channels are mediated by private agencies. And that is where I think this business and human rights issue becomes extremely important. So we already know about the risks in this deregulation. So migrants arrive with debt bondage, and especially the Vietnamese are charged a very high fee, and they are restricted mobility and controlled by the agency. The weak enforcement of the laws, as we saw, and the insufficient labor protection and complicated migration bureaucracy gives advantage to migration industries for exploitation. So as we saw, the violation of the labor laws is like more than 70% of those companies which has been inspected by the Labor Inspection Office, and approximately 2% of the TITPs will become undocumented. And the reason is the debt bondage cannot change the employers, but also the low levels of language at that if they have, like, for example, unpaid wage, they cannot negotiate. So in an interview, this is being told by the director of the care facility. The agency brought 5 to 6 young TITPs, lined them up and said, you can get whoever you like. The way they behaved was just like human trafficking. So this is completely against the responsible business practices. So the director just turned down that offer, but he really points out the danger that the companies may not be able to identify the adverse human rights effects that has been caused in the supply chain. So how are the LTC sector responding to business and human rights? Well, the long-term care sector is not only latecomer in employing migrants, but also locally embedded and often located in very remote areas. So this means that they do not have the resources and means to, for example, go to the rural area in Vietnam and check how the recruitment agencies are working. It's very, very difficult for them to have that kind of idea what is going on the recruitment side. But then what we need to know is that it is managed through the social insurance. This is a public insurance managed by the municipal governments. So if anything happens, it'll damage the trust towards the public institutions. And the positive side of the long-term care sector is that it is a fairly well-organized sector, and care is about protecting dignity and human rights. So the people have that kind of mindset. And also we have the experiences from EPA and resident migrants and aware of the benefits and challenges to work with the migrants. So some of the good examples are that what we did is to setting standards for employment practices. So this has been conducted by the Tokyo Council of Welfare, which has like 90% of the members of the care facilities based in Tokyo belong under this umbrella body. And we developed a guidebook to accept migrant workers, setting the standards for their employment practices. And I served as an advisor to this committee and basically drafted the whole book. And then we got a lot of feedbacks from the care facilities and published this, and it's available online. So what we covered are the labor laws and regulations, social security, diversity management, and how to deal with emergency cases, for example, getting pregnant. And we also introduced the voices of Japanese and migrant care workers in looking into the good practices. So these, for this one, we are having a very positive response, and we hope that the care facilities would take a look into this and sort of follow the guideline. I've also included the link of the business and human rights principles. The other one is to use the local resources in the community. That this was initiated by the care facility in downtown Tokyo, that they started to employ the resident migrants, but then they had the language problem that they can work perfectly as a care worker, but then they could not function well as a team together with the Japanese co-workers. So they wanted to support the migrant care workers. They tapped the resources of the Waseda University's Japanese language education. So the Waseda University provides language courses. And then they also tap the local NPO, which is consisted of retired persons, and to volunteer in teaching. And the local government also joined this initiative. So they try to support the migrant care workers so that they can become the certified care worker. And it is important to understand that the migrants are not always in the service receiving end of the host society, but for those migrants, they created a performance team, and they started to perform in the local communities. So empowered migrants empower the community. And if we look at the nexus between citizenship and qualification, because of the complicated framework, the migrants are scattered into different groups. And what we need to do is to ensure that the migrants will have the citizenship as well as become certified in order to ensure quality care. So to conclude, entitlement of the migrant workers are related to the quality of care and the strengthening of the community, and develop good business practices to support LTC sector in line with the guiding principles is really important. And we will be conducting research on employment practices, including how much the care facilities will be paying to those agencies. And we are also doing training for Japanese care workers on diversity and facilitate discussion on ethical recruitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ogawa. I remember that the foundation used to work on the issues of aging in Japan and Southeast Asia. And the first workshop that we organized with ISEAS 2.5 years ago was actually on this issue. And I believe that what Professor Ogawa mentioned today, empower migrants, empower community, it's not just job, it's life. This is really true and very important. I'd like to hear Professor Ogawa's opinion later on this issue more, if there's time. Last but not least, the final speaker is Professor Hwok, who will be speaking on migrant labor and social protection in Malaysia. Dr. Lee, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Aki, for the kind introduction. And also, I want to thank Sasakawa Peace Foundation and ISEAS Youth Asia Institute for this opportunity to share some research findings and an opportunity to do an update for some of the recent changes that have taken place in Malaysia. So my presentation will be on migrant labor and social protection in Malaysia, and I will have organized it around 3 themes: how Malaysia's policy, which I depict as a more reactive policy, but there has been some recent progress in the last few years, but these also have to overcome vested interests. And so some takeaways that, with a lot of information to come, but again, along those, the 3 themes that were flashed out just now, Malaysia has lacked what I would say it has lacked a coherent and consistent policy on migrant labor, being more reactive and flip-flopping. And so this has resulted in the persistence of undocumented labor, labor protection that continues to be weak, and recurrent forced labor as well. So on the policy side, there's I think a lot of critical analysis that needs to be considered. Secondly, the policy changes and legislation as well have sought to curb labor outsourcing, which is one of the major sources of exploitation and worker abuse, and as well to expand social protection. So, I mean, I think to Malaysia's credit, some of the formal changes in recent years are moving in a positive direction. And I was asked to, we were asked to address the responsible business implications. So I think there's an issue of compliance here with regard to the positive changes. However, the weak enforcement, and there are vested interests in employing migrant labor that is low skill, low wage, and to perpetuate right? The operations that are based on low-skilled and low-wage migrant labor, which are also quite vulnerable, they continue to undermine the efficacy of social protection. And so here, one implication, I think, in the spirit of this project, which is, I would take it as trying to explore, right, business strategies that fill in for deficits in government policy and regulation. So it's a bit of an exhortation for business, which some of which is already, you know, in process, to undertake a more progressive stance in spite of government. Now, to give an idea of Malaysia's situation with regard to the migrant inflows, and here we have the two sources. So the orange line is the formal employment, and this, of course, has a very fundamental importance because being formal and documented confers a legal status and access to social protection. So the brown line is showing the number of permit holders, and you can see the rise, but also it's stabilized about the last decade or so. The triangles, the blue triangles, are based on the labor force survey, which supposed to account for both documented and undocumented, but clearly the undocumented are undercounted. And so the numbers at current are about 2 million foreign work permit holders. Undocumented in Malaysia, as in, I guess, anywhere, but you know, the range is very, very vast, from 1 million to 3 million. So it could be 1 to, you know, 1 or 1 to 1.5 for, documented per undocumented. As noted just now, there is this increase in the 1990s, an acceleration in the 2000s, and it's maintained persistently high in the 2010s. And just to flesh out a few more issues related to migrant workers and Malaysia's policy. It's been a response to labor demand and supply shortages. So there is some, you know, realities in Malaysia's economic growth and development there. But as I said, the more reactive stance and lack of a coherent and consistent strategy, I think, has resulted in a system, right, with that incentivizes low-skill production, hiring low-wage migrant workers. And in particular, for about the last 15, 20 years, this emergence of a profit-driven labor outsourcing industry, I think is widely regarded, right, as a cause of this worker exploitation and some of the worst cases of migrant worker abuses and mistreatment and unfairness. And so it's been a difficult path, right? The difficult path also within the formal system to get documentation and to follow all the rules also induces undocumented labor. And some of the issues are common, and we're hearing that in the presentations as well, where if a work permit is only tied to one employer, that puts a lot of leverage in the employer's hands. And so if they're fired, then the worker becomes undocumented and illegal. So these are some of the issues that I think are common in a few countries. But again, the labor outsourcing industry is one. And I think because of the notoriety gained, the government was compelled to take action, which we'll get to a bit later. This is to give an idea of where the distribution across the different sectors. Again, this is only the work permit holders, but you can see that big numbers in manufacturing, also in agriculture and construction. Agriculture and construction, the incidence of undocumented workers is higher there. Another reason for presenting this data is also to get a sense of the kind of the profile of companies that might be operating in these sectors. Multinationals a bit more in manufacturing. Services is more of a domestic operators. Here I want to touch on one aspect of COVID-19, whereby the Malaysian government has imposed a moratorium on migrant workers in manufacturing, so only allowing them in other sectors like agriculture and construction. And the idea is for Malaysian workers to be prioritized. Now it is a reaction again. I mean, I don't want to be too harsh on this because the circumstances are very difficult and unprecedented. But I think it does go to show that continuing in this way that is just reacting to the circumstances is again not driven by a clear strategy, and it will, I think, continue to be difficult to implement this moratorium in manufacturing, because as long as migrant workers are cheaper to hire, and I think as particular business models persist that rely on heavy overtime and as well on differentials in social protection. So one that I can bring up here is that migrant workers are exempted from employees' provident fund contributions. This is both worker side, but also employers contribute about 12% of monthly salary. So that is a major difference, this having to be provided for Malaysian workers, but not for non-Malaysian foreign workers. Now, there's some structural features that impact of the labor market and policy that impact on migrant labor. And, these have come under scrutiny in the last 8 years or so, especially in the last 8 years with some higher profile reports by NGOs, Verite, Amnesty, and one called SOMO. So as I touched on earlier, the regular channels for labor migration and for formal employment, they gravitate towards high cost and very high recruitment fees, leaving workers in debt and in precarious situations. We have policy flip-flops, including requiring employers to pay the foreign worker levy, and then allowing that to be deducted from a worker salary, and then back again requiring that to be paid by the employers. So back and forth, but even through that also not really very stringently enforced. So we have this persistent irregular migration, right? Clandestine entry and workers that remain undocumented all the way. Then there's also workers that might enter through the regular channel, but then move into become undocumented, and possibly by voluntary due to voluntary reasons, or they are forced forced by circumstance. This profit-driven labor outsourcing industry, just to say a little bit more, whereby which involves employment by a third party, and it undermines employer accountability, because workers are now under this labor contractor and migrating from workplace to another, and so there's no clear accountability and line of between who is their employer and where is their workplace, and the social protection requirements associated with the workplace. And so it is recurrent and a source of a lot of migrant worker abuse. Now, these were officially eliminated last year, so licenses were not renewed, and officially there's been a policy shift towards direct employment. So employers, workers have to be directly employed by an employer producing something. But speaking with some labor activists recently, there's quite unclear direction and enforcement and what all this entails, and there are vestiges of the outsourcing system, although it's no more legal, but still this sort of third-party and triangular structure in place. Another element of the system is that the jurisdiction for some of these decisions is under the Ministry of Home Affairs, and it still holds a lot of decision-making power. It was overseeing the rise of this labor outsourcing industry, not the Ministry of Human Resources, and there continues to be, power struggle between the two. But the policy recommendations to hand over more jurisdiction to Ministry of Human Resources has been resisted by the Ministry of Home Affairs. Another aspect I want to point out is that migrant worker representation and access to justice. This was unpacked a bit more by Professor Tham Siew Yen last week, but let me just bring out the unionization aspect that is already low in Malaysia. Only 2 to 3% of private sector workers are unionized, and foreign workers are legally permitted, but face many practical hurdles. So membership is also very low, and so they're precluded from that, having that voice and advocacy and line of defense, and limited legal recourse, including access, to legal aid is still very limited for migrant workers. Some multilateral and bilateral aspects are also important for context of Malaysia's situation with migrant labor. And there's been a shift to government to government, G2G framework, which is part of the effort to eliminate intermediaries and outsourcing companies. So in principle, I think it's a positive move and quite widely regarded positively, but Malaysia cannot kind of shake some of these habits where moving to a centralized system has created monopolies, private monopolies. Some have already existed, but some new ones are also being created. So instead of many players, now there's large contracts being allocated to one big player for biomedical screening, even for visa issuance, work permit renewals, and health screenings. So there is this element again of the vested interests in facilitating workplace migration, and I think it would have an impact on having an incentive to have more and more migrant workers, especially low skill and low wage workers. Malaysia engages in MOUs with many countries, but this point brought up to me recently was that there is no standard baseline for negotiations. And so, that is an issue, and sometimes it's the sending country that is raising concerns about standards when Malaysia, as the more advanced country, is resisting. So social protection programs specific to migrant workers. Now, minimum wage was introduced in 2014, and it's not specific to nationality. All our workers are entitled to at least a minimum wage, but many are migrant workers, and there's concern over enforcement, especially overtime pay. And Malaysian economy continues to generate a lot of elementary and semi-skilled jobs. So I think these two are intertwined and are militating against Malaysia's strategy to move up to a higher wage and higher skilled economy. Social Security Organization, SOCSO Employment Injury Scheme was open to migrant workers just last year, and it covers injury and impairment. So it's a major step and a broader coverage. But as of last year, which was until December last year, the period for workers to get registered, only half of documented workers are registered. So there's an issue of compliance and enforcement there. And this year, in some of the developments this year, just to bring to attention, in July, Malaysia was in the international spotlight for forced labor in plantations, in rubber gloves, and also some infamy for the deportation of a Bangladeshi worker who appeared in Al Jazeera documentary. So I do wrap up here and with points trying to address the issue of responsible business. Malaysia's recent policy changes, there are some positives. And so this brings up the issue more along the lines of compliance for business. But doing business in a country with labor standards, right, that is lagging the expected levels of upper middle income country, I think this is calling for going beyond the domestic regulations, not capitalizing on the deficiencies and holding to ethical business codes that go above and beyond the national requirements. And also regarding the national objectives in Malaysia and other countries of high-skilled jobs and wage growth, I think one implication to draw out here is business strategies that resist race to the bottom tendencies and that perpetuate low-skill, low-wage employment that also tend to correspond with poor worker protection and social protection. And with that, I conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for providing comprehensive picture of migration and social protection policies in Malaysia. I initially thought that the shift to G2T framework to eliminate intermediaries is a good idea, but maybe not enough. And I suppose that this is something that other countries can also learn from Malaysia's experience. Okay, and I'd like to thank all 4 speakers for giving us the very insightful and critical presentations. And now we are moving on to the Q&A session. For our audience, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your questions. I already see one. And we will collect the questions from now till the end of this webinar. And at the meantime, while you are thinking about your questions, let me start asking the first question to our panel of speakers. Under the current situation, I think I have to ask this question first. How is the pandemic affecting migrant workers in the countries of your research or your focus? Can we begin with Dr. McBain?
Thank you. It's an interesting question because it does have an impact. So if I give the example of Thailand, there is currently a closed border between Thailand and Myanmar. So whilst Thailand relies quite heavily on migrant workers, particularly in the processing sector and the fishing sector, they are unable to come across to Thailand. So the government was renegotiating an agreement to be able to bring workers in, provided that they go into quarantine first. But with a recent outbreak or a spike in cases in Myanmar, that has gone on hold. If we look at the seafood sector more broadly and actually seafarers, it's a huge issue because if you take 90% of everything is sent via sea transport, very few port states are allowing seafarers, including fishers, to come back to land. So whether that's for medical treatment, because they've finished the end of their contract, or to change crews. And so you have people who've been at sea for many, many months now, which is really bordering towards a serious humanitarian issue for those seafarers.
Thank you very much, Dr. McBain. Professor Asato, would you like to add something?
Well, in my case, I have conducted some survey for targeting the immigrants in Japan, around the 600, and then I visited the households. So I got to know that the impact of pandemic is not the same among migrant workers or immigrants. It differs. The impact differs by Oh, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think there was a little technical issue, but I think we can hear you now. So please continue.
Now, American military base, some airplanes flying around here. Sorry, I'm now talking to you from Okinawa, and now there is a training. I'm sorry. Oh, now there is a big military aircraft now passing. So
okay,
maybe
can we
go to the next?
Can we back?
Okay.
Okay, can we come back to you later?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that. Professor Ogawa.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. I think the pandemic has affected the migrants in different ways, and those who are hardly hit are the students and the TITPs, and especially for those students who were just about to graduate in March and go into the labor market from April. A lot of them could not get hired, especially for those in the hotels and restaurants, the service sector largely, because they sort of closed down their business. And even for factories, some of them really suffered very hard because they no longer had any income. So there's a lot of self-help groups that has been established according to different ethnic groups. So the students and the TITPs who also got fired or just that their contract has been terminated. There's a lot of self-help groups are going on, and the civil society also responded very quickly in supporting those migrants and providing them with financial means and shelters and food, etc. As far as the long-term care sector has been concerned, since it's a very stable employment, I am not aware whether there's a lot of people losing their jobs, but rather the people are joining into the labor market of care for those who have lost their jobs in the other service sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ogawa. Dr. Lee, I understand that you have already touched on this issue, but would you like to add something?
Yeah, well, let me just say a little bit more. I think, yes, we can gather, right, that there have been very substantial impacts on migrant workers, but at the same time, you know, it can be quite hard to keep track because if they are due to the vulnerability of their situation, and if they have lost their job, then technically they become undocumented, and so they go into hiding. But we can see from the work of charities and NGOs, you know, that have had to provide them with food and a lot of basic needs, that I think the impacts have been quite severe. And as well as one other aspect is related to social protection is the payment for health screening. And my understanding is that initially in Malaysia, the employers were required to do that, but there was some resistance. And then it was agreed that it would come out of the SOCSO, the Social Security Organization, if they have an account, and some of them don't. So yeah, there are all these issues that I think the impact is broad, but there's also quite a lot of unknowns.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali. Okay, all right. I see some questions at the Q&A box. Let's begin with Mr. Kailod. Are there any undertakings by ASEAN in Japan to promote harmonization of regulations pertaining to migration for work between ASEAN countries, for instance, Myanmar to Thailand, Philippines to Singapore, etc., and with Japan? Maybe I can ask this question to Professor Asato. Mr. Asato, I hope that the audio is...
Let me just answer the question. Well, as far as
Professor? Okay, so meantime, let's move on to our next question. This is from Ms. Noriko Hara. This is a question to Dr. Darian on how the grievance system is working in Thai Union. Dr. Darian?
Hi, thank you. So we have multiple levels of grievance systems. It could come in through our own HR-provided worker hotlines. It could come in through external groups. So we have at least 2 different NGOs who provide a grievance mechanism, a third-party grievance mechanism. We have a global, more of a whistleblowing platform, but grievances do go through that. And then we have support from our customers for doing different kinds of grievance mechanisms. And in fact, through one of our customers at the moment, we're working with Verite on improving grievance mechanisms, but also worker voice. So I think I would say for us, it's been a journey, and there are always different ways to improve. And the more that you listen to the workers, the more that you find out and continue on that journey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Darian. Okay, the next question is from Professor Sato. Is there any impact on your research by the UN Global Compact for migration? How will it be implemented? Any update or follow-up for this framework for improving migrant workers in your region? Any policy suggestion? May I ask this question to Dr. Lee?
Sorry, this is the UN Global Compact for Migration?
Yes.
Yeah, I am not well versed enough about this, and I think it's quite a specific one. Yeah, so, and the question as well is kind of has a regional context. So I think, yeah, I would just have to say thank you for bringing that to our attention, something to follow up on.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee. Are there any panelists who wish to answer this question? Okay. Okay, maybe we'll come back to this question later. I have a question from Wani Zainal. I understand that migration of workers in your country of study is the semi-skilled, unskilled. Despite this, do you see a rise in xenophobic reactions towards these migrants amongst the locals? Can I ask this question to Professor Ogawa?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I think it's the xenophobic ideas has been on rise, especially with this pandemic, that would sort of try to distinguish the others. That, but then at the local level, I would see it rather as like taking the forms of microaggression that would sort of try to differentiate and discriminate the others and justify that they are in an inferior position. So, and of course, the larger xenophobic takes place in Japan, targeting towards the old comers, that's the Koreans and the Chinese, and the government still have not made a proper regulation to regulate the discrimination in the society. So as far as the migrants will increase in the future, I think the xenophobic ideas would spread too.
Thank you very much, Professor Ogawa. On behalf of Professor Asato, he wrote the answer to the text, so let me just read it. So Japan's harmonization regarding migrant regulation is bilateral basis, what are called MOUs and MOCs. However, this does not bind law. Regarding the bilateral agreement among sending countries, the Philippines and Indonesia signed agreement. However, global structure of race to the bottom has not changed. Multilateral framework on price control should be implemented. Okay. So here is another question for Dr. Asato from Ms. Hikari Ono. What makes the difference of the recruitment cost between original countries? Why the number of workers from Vietnam is the largest, even though the cost is the highest? Professor Asato, could you try to answer online? And yeah, if it doesn't work, I'll ask you to answer via text again.
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The Vietnamese usually, for example, have to shoulder like 10,000 US dollars for the placement. And this payment will be utilized not only for the language education or skills training, but also welcoming Japanese visitors. So the more if the agency have more money from the migrants, they can welcome more Japanese guests. And also some part of the displacement fee will go to the employing company as a reward or rebate. Therefore, many employing company, to reduce the cost, they just choose the workers from the high recruitment cost. For example, but unfortunately or contradictorily, Philippines, they usually collect 2,000 to 3,000 US dollars from migrant workers. Maybe the agency may not have enough capital for the better education or better training system, and also not prepared for welcoming guests from Japan, employing company. So that's the mechanism. This is what is called irony of a global market.
Thank you very much, and that audio was fine this time. Okay, and I have another question for Dr. McBain from Mr. Thomas. How does Thai Union manage improving worker voice mechanisms? How effective has the mechanisms been? Dr. McBain?
Thank you, and hello to Thomas. We manage them by using a number of different mechanisms and then looking at which are the most effective. So one of the things that we've learned is that building trust in a mechanism is vital, that you can build a mechanism, but if the workers don't trust that it is actually going to be effective, then it won't be used. And so to build the trust, you generally need to have a lot of person-to-person contact and understanding of what is going to happen within those mechanisms. And if I take the example of a third-party hotline, there is generally some kind of relationship and trust between the NGO who are running the hotline and the workers, and that's often built through face-to-face interaction. If we're looking at HR drop-in clinics as an example, then there needs to be a level of faith and trust that the HR team will actually act on the information that they're provided with. And if we look at some of the newer mechanisms that are all online, I think anonymity provides some level of trust that they can't be identified and that there can be no retaliation, but definitely having the involvement of, say, a worker welfare committee where you can have multiple workers represented along with management and some guidance, for example, from unions, then you do tend to build up trust perhaps faster than some of the other mechanisms.
Thank you very much, Dr. McBain. I think there was, okay. Well, actually, there was a question for Professor Asato, but he kindly responded to the question himself. Okay, and I have two more questions. One for Professor Ogawa, and I think that the link between care workers and community is a key to this issue, but then it might require some kind of policies for inclusion. Could you provide some thoughts on this, Professor Ogawa?
Well, thank you very much. I think the key is that actually, if you look at all those stakeholders, they depend on each other. So the care facility depends on the migrants the migrants depends on the employment. And the elderly, the NGO in the community also depends on the care facility and the migrants. And the municipal government also depends on the whole structure. So in a way, it's this dependency towards each other that creates the win-win-win situation to everybody. So everybody needs each other and they cannot survive with each other. So if we can set up with that kind of structure, I think we can sort of cut this vicious cycle of having this slavery-like migrants working in a slavery-like condition, but twist it to have a more positive cycle of win-win-win.
Thank you very much, Professor Ogawa. One last question for Dr. Lee. And what can business enterprises do to help vulnerable migrant workers, especially women, low-skilled or informal workers? And how can business enterprises develop synergies with governments in their actions? Dr. Lee, please.
Yeah, well, I think I will kind of fall back on the framework, or just really two major themes of compliance, and as well as maybe talk about, call it strategy. And I think for, so this is all very country dependent, obviously, but for Malaysia, that has introduced social protection schemes and expanded it for migrant workers, just to be compliant and be conscientious about that. But then again, also the standards, right, may be deficient within countries, including some issues for Malaysia. So in that case, I mean, I think sort of taking the higher road, I think we are probably in an era where there is a greater examination about business operations, about the mode of capitalism, and expanding the objectives, right, beyond just the financial profit line towards various other objectives and stakeholders, and as well, I think, you know, consumers that are a little bit more broader, right, in demanding or in showing they're willing to take into account, you know, ethics and practices and environmental and social considerations. So I guess being mindful of that, being engaged, you know, with a government to raise the standards, and as well as I think some global initiatives, global pacts or agreements that are, and codes and certification and so on, I mean, would need to be more critically examined on a case by case. But I think there are various ways and various initiatives that can be done bilaterally and multilaterally.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. And I would like to thank our 4 speakers for their presentations and answers, and also to our audience for joining us this morning. Our next webinar under this series will be on the topic of delivering post-COVID recovery and fighting inequalities by sustainable finance. And that webinar will be held next Wednesday, again, at 9:30 Singapore time, 10:30 a.m. Japan time. We look forward to connecting with you again next week. And at the meantime, please take care and have a pleasant day ahead. Thank you. Goodbye.